Well, welcome everyone, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sophie Matthiesson to this evening. We've had great fun putting together the PowerPoint. I'll bring up the main screen so that we can start the PowerPoint. It begins with the same image, and I'll just get rid of that. There we are. So Sophie has taken over my former position at Auckland Art Gallery, and I have to say I couldn't be more thrilled and more excited. I've known Sophie for we've known each other for quite a long time, haven't we, Sophie? We met over round about the time of the Modern Britain exhibition that was held at the National Gallery of Victoria, and was it 2007, I think, so it's quite a long time. I had red hair then, things have changed, and I thought I'd start off by just one of the things that was a very, very important exhibition, and it was curated by Ted Gott, Laurie Benson and Sophie, and it put together modernist works from all around Australasia. And I've just got 3 slides because I hadn't sort of thought about this before, but there are certain, in fact, I think I've got 4. There are certain synchronicities, Sophie, aren't there, between the National Gallery of Victoria's collection and ours? Although, of course, the National Gallery of Victoria has a huge and remarkable and very well-funded collection. So let's just start with this. And do you want me to go through the 4 images and then you talk about them generally, or do you want to talk about them one at a time?
Oh, I'm happy either way. Mary, you choose.
Well, we've got obviously this fascinating both this pairing of the Henry Moore works. You know, we've got the Little Study from 1945, and you've got Family Group from 1947, and then the NGV has got Ben Nicholson's beautiful 1938, and the work that was acquired by the Thanksgiving Trust and is on loan to Auckland Art Gallery, 1939 composition. And let's just talk for a minute about these, because you were quite surprised to find the Ben Nicholson, what I say is, just to differentiate, our Ben Nicholson, when you first arrived at the beginning of the year.
Well, yes, because Ben Nicholson, in his abstract phase at this time, in the 38, 39, was a very acquired taste. It was only really the most enlightened people who had these works. He found them difficult to sell, except to fellow architects and minimalists and people who knew the French scene, who knew Mondrian, for example, because these works were associated with Stalinism around the same time as the 1938 trials, Stalin's trials, Kenneth Clark had really criticised Nicholson, particularly for his white abstracts, which he found sort of chilling and totalitarian.
And yet they were really important, weren't they, for the introduction of abstraction into English art?
Yes, so Ben Nicholson, whatever you might think of him as a person, he was clearly a very abrasive, egotistical man. He was quite visionary, and he had that force of character to really bring along a large group of people towards abstraction and away from surrealism. So we see a sort of peeling off between Paul Nash, who was an older man who liked organic forms in the Francis Hodgkin way, and Ben Nicholson. There's a schism there, and Ben Nicholson took a group of people down this particular path. Of course, Nicholson, this is his most austere phase, and he had a great sense of organic form as well, and a great sense of light. And I love his art, and for a few years, while I was a poor student, I was making my own abstract white reliefs. I only kept one for myself because I was so sought after in Leeds, where I was doing them. So, but anyway, I just gave them away as presents, but that I was captivated by them.
We could set you up as a little sideline. You could make us all little miniature Ben Nicholsons. The surfaces on these are so beautiful as well, aren't they? I mean, I think probably most people, because we've had the Thanksgiving Trust work up a lot at the gallery, and it has quite a remarkable surface, and as you say, very influenced by Mondrian. And of course, it was Winifred Nicholson who brought Mondrian to London at this time, and so he became very influential. And it was a shame, really, that he was the war frightened him off, and he went to America. But it would have been interesting to think what might have happened to England if he had remained.
Well, he actually lived in the same sort of artist kind of neighbourhood in Hampstead, in Belsize Park, with Nicholson's, and who else was there? Jim Eade from and Henry Moore was down the road, and I lived there for 10 years when I was in London. I lived in that area, so it was strange to walk past the old studio spaces. But what a little hive of activity! And Herbert Reed later called it a gentle nest of artists. It was anything but a gentle nest of artists, but it was a highly creative time.
Yes. It was a very exciting time for English art.
And so we only acquired the NGV acquired the Ben Nicholson in recent years, and I think it was just an inspired acquisition.
Well, the other great similarity that I hadn't realised was because you were responsible for both modernist and historical art, just as I was at Auckland, and we had since the 60s this wonderful, very simple, I always think of it as a sort of proto-modernist form because of its simplicity, for the Christ and Majesty, missing its arms, of course, because it was carved out of a single trunk of wood, and then the arms were attached. But you also were involved in acquiring this work for the National Gallery of Victoria, weren't you?
Yes, they're absolutely out of the same stable, and yet there's a few centuries between them. The idea of the seated Christ, well, Christ and Majesty, he's not humiliated here, but the seated life-size Christ was a very powerful one, and I have yet to look further into the one here in Auckland, but I certainly know about the one on the right, the Melbourne one, that it came from France from the 1470s, and it was probably carried out into the community during the Palm Sunday and Easter processions. So his hands are like this. He actually had real rope around his wrists, a real palm frond put in his hands, a real crown of thorns. And it must have just seemed like, sort of just the most lifelike performance.
Yes, absolutely.
Believers. And this is, and our Auckland one's a bit more like a part of the architecture, timeless.
Yes, and it is, at that time, it was made to go in a niche in a convent. And of course, its hands probably became damaged from people touching it, but also the paint on the feet and that lower bit of wood, it may have been quite high up because as people have touched it to sort of absorb the sort of blessing from the sculpture itself and worn away the wood. But it's really quite unusual to find a sculpture so early that still has some of its paint remaining. A lot of them end up getting cleaned off. But it's that division in the face. For some reason, I keep thinking of a New Zealand artist, Fomerson, who anyone listening will know of. But there's something about the rawness of the way the face has been sculpted that somehow seems very contemporary as well. And the way he looks away as well, whereas the NGV work, he looks down with such resignation but such sadness, and it's this introduction of feeling, of emotion into a sculpture.
Just from the slight tilt of the head, the slight asymmetry. But I also find the hieratic Spanish one very effective because of that sort of stillness.
Yes, and
contemplative.
It's really lovely. And the fourth, and this is the last sort of similarity that I put up, we've got this tiny Paris Bourdonnais work, which is thought by one or two writers to be one of the very first paintings that he did as an adult artist. But the NGV has got the spectacular, much larger scene, the rest on the flight into Egypt, and it's beautiful. So did you know before you came to Auckland that you would find these works that were by the same artists? Had you sort of trolled through the website?
Yes, I did, because you never know. A visual test can be part of the interview process. But certainly was when I went to Melbourne, and so I wasn't going to be caught out that way. But it was it was a great surprise to see that there was a Bordoni, but also I never did the comparison, but the faces.
Yes.
Are so extraordinarily similar. Even Saint Sebastian looks like Catherine.
And the treatment of the colours that Bordoni uses, I mean, you can see the same palette, but also his Saint Sebastian's loincloth, that rich gold, and the way in which he's painted the folds, it's very, very sensitively done. So how many years were you at the National Gallery Victoria? What year did you start?
2005, I think it was.
Okay, so a couple of years before we met.
Yeah, and it was go, go, go from the very start. There were so many projects, the Modern Britain project being one of them. It was just a rollick, really. I worked with two fantastic people that you know very well, Ted Gott and Laurie Benson. And they knew how to sort of inject the fun into every hour of the day. The amount of laughter that came out of our corridor was quite amazing.
You can't get through a working day unless you can have a good laugh, I always think.
Yes, and although we were very different personalities, we ended up sort of, to some extent, thinking with the sort of the same brain. We were working so closely together.
Now, these were the two touring exhibitions that you worked on that you chose to talk about as highlights. So would you like to just give us a bit of background to them?
Well, we worked on basically one or more major exhibitions every year. So we were delivering them in a very sort of quick succession, and they were always huge. But all of them stand out for different reasons. The Viennese show stood out because all the exhibitions I've worked on where I didn't know much about the material to start with have been incredibly rewarding, because if it hadn't been for that show, then I might have gone on in ignorance. But Vienna Art and Design took me to Vienna. It made me understand the world's 20th century through design and urban planning principles. The artists were so caught up with ideas of sort of social reform through design, improving life through design. And it was a great basis for beginning to understand, for example, Art Nouveau looking backwards, but also Bauhaus looking forwards, and to see how different, how differently oriented Vienna was in 1900. It looked to Scotland, for example, but it also looked to Poland and further sort of, it looked east as well. And so Vienna is very much in the blind spot in Australia. You don't really learn about Austrian history or art history, and yet we had so many Austrian emigres from before and during the Second World War.
Yes.
And they're part of the fabric of Melbourne. So doing that show meant I looked at plates and glasses and chairs, tonnet chairs, for example, in a different way altogether, and understood them as part of this Gesamtkunstwerk, an idea where all design should affect and improve every part of society and lived experience.
Right.
So that was a very big thing to understand. Monet's Garden was a great interest to me because it was the first big show that I had sole responsibility for delivering. It was while Ted was on long service leave, and he generally does our French shows. Because he's absolutely bilingual, etc. But it was a great thing for me because the challenge was to do a Monet's Garden show about the lily ponds and things, but say something new. And because you can imagine how many shows there have been about Monet's lilies and irises. And the thing I realised was that Monet was always promoted by dealers as an eye, only an eye, not a brain. And Monet read extensively. When I realised what he had in his library and who he was meeting in his garden, then I started to realise that the garden, particularly the lily pond, represented a political ideal. And he talked about it, he read about it, but no dealers ever, or curators ever really gave him credit for being on top of all of the most interesting ideas of his moment. And he all his friends were political radicals.
That's right, yeah.
So, but that's been airbrushed out of history. But once you understand that, you realise that the garden meant something very important to him about peace and about shared goods and about harmony. And this is him coming out of having been in the Paris Commune, fighting alongside other artists and ordinary people. He came away in 1872 from Paris, wouldn't go back there, and he created a refuge in Giverny.
Yes.
And people don't really understand that. And so I was thrilled to be able to connect up very exciting political history with some of the most beautiful nature studies and paintings ever made. So so that was great. The French, for whatever reason, don't seem to write about Monet as a kind of a man of political ideas.
Well, I talked to Kim Hill, funny enough, about Monet's garden a couple of 3 or 4 weeks back. And I was fascinated to know that he didn't just plant the garden. He researched every plant and where they would fit. You know, the garden was like a painting in itself, the way in which he created it. But he also thought very seriously about what might grow, what wouldn't grow. I mean, he was a real scholar in his own way.
Yes, and he had full subscriptions to the most expensive horticultural magazines, and he was corresponding with people in Japan and Russia for hybrids, for agapanthus, for all sorts of things. He was indefatigable. He was putting all his money into the garden in the end.
So it seems good to me.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Now you asked me to put up this image, the Master of the Stories of Helen. So tell us why you found this work particularly important for your own time at the NGV.
Because we have a person at the NGV who was like Melbourne's answer to Sarah Hillary, and that was John Payne. And we worked closely with him and with the Painting Conservation Department, but in particular with him over many projects. But this is one that has occupied him for his entire career. He's had a few cleaning and restoration campaigns. And towards the end of his career, he decided he wanted to fill in some, take back overpaint and fill in gaps and investigate it thoroughly. And it was one of those paintings that's always defied interpretation. No one has ever cracked the code of what's going on in it. Is the woman injecting something into the water, or is she drawing something out of it? What's the game with the hat and the sort of the stub of a fabric in the woman's hand? What is going on? And I am quite pleased to say that it still hasn't been solved. But in the time I've worked at the gallery in Melbourne, I've seen this picture transformed, the yellowing paint taken off, the blue sky revealed. And then John really pushed himself forward, and he in-painted the sleeve. The woman on the far right had her entire sleeve with all that brocade scrubbed off.
Oh, really?
And John did some of the most inventive research to reinstate that sleeve. And so it was amazing to see it finally go back up on the walls in a sensitive period frame. He reframed it at the same time. It was a real process of love. And so he'd not long got it on the wall before he left and he retired, and then I moved on as well. So, but it's a magnificent work.
Yes, and it's a large work as well, isn't it? It's a good scale.
Yeah, and it's defied everybody. So there's some magical interpretation, and I'm just waiting for the genius who figures out what it and the related panels are all about.
There'll be a reference to Boccaccio in there somewhere, I wouldn't mind betting.
Okay, Mary, if you're so clever, why don't you do it?
I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. I'd love to do it. But now what I want you to do is tell us a little bit about your doctoral thesis, because the subject I find absolutely fascinating. It's already, you've made it apparent with talking tonight, just that politics is something that's really important to you in your research. But tell us about why you chose, what your topic was and why you chose it.
Well, the subject is artists in prison in the French Revolution, and I discovered in the course of about 15 years of research that there had been hundreds, close to, well, over 1,000 painters, sculptors, architects and designers in prison in the years of the Terror, 1793 to the end of the reaction, 1795. Within the space of 3 years, there had been over 1,200 artists among the 500,000 people, civilians, who were thrown into political prisons. And they were, for various reasons, either too left-wing, too right-wing, too indecisive. You could get thrown into prison for all sorts of reasons in the end. You could keep your money. And at various points, prisoners were being liquidated, particularly in the Reign of Terror under Robespierre. There were about 9 weeks where people were being sent to the guillotine in large numbers. Now, with all that talent in prisons and so many royal, aristocrats and bankers and wealthy people, after a few months, you just stop worrying about dying so much, and you just decide to get on with writing a book, going and visiting the painters. The painters could get materials brought in, and so there was this industry where famous artists were servicing famous patrons, and portraits, understandably, were the most popular, sought after images, because partly people wanted something to mark their experience and perhaps leave something behind if they were executed. This couple that we're seeing here have had their portraits made on little tabatiere and their little, or bonbonniere, little sweets boxes. They would have ordered them specially. The boxes are tortoise shell, so the artist who was in prison would have got them from a dealer outside through a servant. He would have paid someone a tip to go and bring in the materials. The underside would have had some woven initials in the victim's hair, and both of the sitters, husband and wife, a marquis and a marquise, went to the guillotine, so they died. But I have found 7 little paintings around the world, same dimensions, also boxes that have the inscription that says, made in the prison of Luxembourg, March 94. So I've pulled together a whole group, and I've worked out who the artist was. It was a woman.
Really?
And so that was a bit of a thrill. And I've just one by one solved a lot of mysteries, and brought a huge amount of material, which is all prison made, sculptures, plates, painted plates by the most famous landscape painter of the time, Hubert Robert. He painted his prison plates, the plates that he got his food on. And now, why did he do that? And he painted scenes for his fellow prisoners. And I worked out that he was so disgusted by having to eat off communal cracked plates that he chose to just eat bread. And he was making a point by taking out the plates out of circulation and turning them into decorative objects to please the eye. It was a very 18th century idea that that you were going to overcome these petty trials and tribulations and make a joke, make light of the horrible situation. And so he painted over 50 of these.
Really?
One a day.
Yeah.
One a day for 50 days.
The other thing, of course, what it indicates is it's a scene, it's somebody working, painting the plate, but it's also a scene of somebody, leaning over a table. And the only way that you would make sense of that kind of experience is to fill your day, to be busy. Thinking about COVID and how we all had to find tasks to do when we weren't meant to be going out. And, if you didn't know when this was painted, you might think, just a funny little genre scene and move beyond it. But when you actually think about when it was painted and why, it takes on much more resonance, doesn't it?
Yes, and it's interesting, they're mostly aristocrats and highly educated people in the prison. And the jailer is being shown here almost bestial, sort of crouched over his table with his clogs, labouring over writing the name of a prisoner. So there's a lot of mockery in there, but it's also quite a gentle scene because he's surrounded by cats, and the prison officers were known to love their cats. And the cats kept the mice down in the prisons, but behind him there are little, there's chamber pots that he would rent out. There's carafes for water. There's spare blankets, so he could lease bedding and chamberware to the prisoners until they could organise to have some purchased and bought in for themselves. So it's a lot going on in that little picture, and I've had a lot of fun. But the PhD took almost 20 years because you had to figure it all out. It just took such a long time to kind of read enough prison memoirs to work out what these things are.
But it's such a fascinating topic. I particularly love the bust that you chose here. I think and this is a really French tradition, isn't it? These terracotta busts of the time. This is very, very beautiful.
Well, this is the one surviving sculpture, but I know that some famous sculptors got together fellow prisoners who are also well-known artists, and they did collectively made sculptures. And they had the know-how. They could just dig up the clay in their yards, and they knew how to purify it, strain the clay, settle the clay, and then one would make the infrastructure, the armature. Another would do the modelling. Another would create the plinth. A poet might inscribe it or create some poems to go with it. And so these were some of the extraordinary things that people got up to. And if you didn't have a trestle, a sculptor's stool, one sculptor just used the deep windowsill in his cell. They improvised, and so I just got very caught up with all of that. Just how on earth was it done? Because a lot of these things people assumed they can't possibly have been made in prison, but I know for a fact that they were, and I found the documents that tell me, and so it makes us rethink what the prison was like.
That's right.
Yes, I think this might be my last one for this area, but so Hubert Robert, the great landscape painter, paints a friend, a scholar, a numismatist, a coin expert. In his cell, he had money, so he could afford to have a proper flued fireplace, like a little Godin stove, those little French wood stoves. Okay. And he's got fire. People were terrified of fires in their cells. Well, he's got an ash tray, an ember tray at the bottom of the stove. He's got some water on the ground beside. He's got a bellows. And the most important thing is this stove is flued out to the window. So he's got a safe setup, and he writes books. Those books were later published when he was released. So what we're looking at is a man who's rather nicely set up. And those cases above his head contain all of his beautiful porcelain. They're nécessaire. They're traveling dinner kits. And he's got a nécessaire that he's sitting his book on, and that's for writing. You would open up that little box that he's tilted his books on, and there'll be a kit of paper and ink. So he's a gentleman who's got himself very nicely sorted out for possibly 2 or 3 years of confinement.
Luckily, as you said, he was one person who did escape the guillotine.
He did, but nobody has ever figured out what this means or why it's so important. And so, but it took me years of reading letters to figure out why this is a picture of a man beautifully set up to have a stoic, scholarly life in prison.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, what I'm also fascinated by are your own collecting interests. So we've got this lovely 2 images here, which you can just speak briefly about your own particular interests.
Well, after 10 years in the UK and being very much a Eurocentric person while I was in England, I came back to Australia and started travelling in Asia. A colleague took me to India, and it was just the beginning of a complete sort of shift in my personal collecting interests. So I went to India and then to Vietnam and places, and now I just collect my relaxation is to collect Asian art and textiles, Central Asian as well, and paintings. And I always have a take home, something in the suitcase when I come back from somewhere. And I started off before I did my European, my master's and PhD. I had started off actually in the Oceanic and Indigenous collection at Melbourne under Judith Ryan, who's still there. And so I was really just, I started off with PNG art, and I'm sort of back to PNG art, and really all the Southeast Asian art. I just love it. It's a hobby, but now that I'm in this new job, I've had the pleasure already of doing a Japan show, so I can't believe it. So happy about it. So this is a fun picture because one of our colleagues from Japan is unfolding one of the great screens, and it was a real action shot, and Matsuo-san is kind of spread-eagled as he unfolds the screen, but it was very exciting because to see these beautiful things sort of suddenly standing up and out of their boxes, and to see all that detail is quite amazing. But it was also wonderful to see our two Japanese colleagues from Tokyo sort of working with these things. They work like with one brain. It was like choreography, the way they moved.
That's exactly what I thought. It was balletic. You know, the way they thought about it, and then suddenly would move, and either the screen would unroll on the wall, or
I took quite a lot of footage. I just couldn't take my eyes off it. They didn't talk, it was like ballet, definitely.
Yeah, it's a lovely image. Now you're also busy working on possibilities for future shows at the gallery at the moment, aren't you?
Yes, well, I mean, this looks likely to happen. This is going to be an icons of the East, of the Orthodox world. So Greek, Russian, Ethiopian, Ukrainian. There's a collection in Australia, and they're astounding. They're like the equivalent of Uccellos. But here in New Zealand and in Australia too, this Orthodox tradition, out of which the Venetian and the Italian tradition arose, is pretty much unknown here. And many of us might remember, I don't, but the 1982 exhibition that came to New Zealand that Rodney Wilson got up. Well, it's 1982 since there's been a big icon show in New Zealand, and something similar was the case in Australia, and so I'd like to sort of reverse that and have a look at the Eastern Renaissance tradition.
And one of the things that I love about these icons, and I don't know Russian icons as well, but I do know Greek icons quite well, and Italian, and it's that particularly the early ones, there's a kind of simplicity of form, which is a great foreshadowing of modernism as well, where you strip away the sophisticated knowledge of the artist in foreshortening and painting 3 dimensions, and yet these are works even without those. You get the sort of structures on the one on the right, those sort of 3 bands of height, if you like, so you up the image, but they are very, very powerful when you look at them in the flesh, and they have a great ability, like that beautiful derision of Christ, or Christ and Majesty, of capturing very simply human emotion. And so I think that would be very powerful if we could get that here. I'd love to see it. So I hope.
And there's 20 years between, say, 1900 and 1920. People like Roger Fry and the early modernists, Matisse, for example,
yes,
cottoned on to the extraordinary richness that came out of that Byzantine and Orthodox tradition. And they were trying to tell people, but it was the artists who understood the power of these things outside the Orthodox world. And here in New Zealand, there are artists. Colin McCann references this sort of material. Stephen Banbury does. All sorts of people knew about it. The artists knew. Yes. And so that's why I think it would be just wonderful. One of the reasons why it'd be wonderful to see it all again with fresh eyes, because it never comes to this part of the world.
Yeah.
We know that the Greeks and the Russians have their icons, but we never connect with them at all because we see them as kind of pious, sometimes.
Well, the other thing too, of course, is that because this is from Australia and accessible, we have to accept the fact in the next couple of years that it may be very hard to get bigger shows from further afield. You know, we have to be quite canny and look around our own neighbourhood and see what it is possible to borrow.
Yes, absolutely. We will have to make our own fun for the next few years. And I think that's a great thing. We were talking about that with Kirsten just yesterday. I think that these periods where you have to be resourceful are wonderful. I mean, we all probably remember what happened in London in the Blitz. They put all the art into storage, and they brought one work out a month back to London, and everybody got behind that one work. Myra Hess would perform on piano, and it was a huge success. Well, we're sort of in a similar situation for a while now, when we may not be able to have riches, you know, to pick from all day, every day, but we may have to just make more with less. And it's a great discipline, and it will really, I think, challenge our creativity. I'm looking forward to it a lot.
And you've had, are you able to talk a little bit about a couple of other ideas that you've had for shows from within the collection?
Well, I'd like to sort of throw out some suggestions to listeners. Some of you may know that, that thanks to Penny Deaver and colleagues here at the gallery, that we have a Giacometti, a set of Giacometti Paris pictures coming in as a gift from two donors. I'd love to know if there's a Giacometti sculpture somewhere in New Zealand. We want to put these beautiful lithographs out. We'd love to put a sculpture with it. I need a bit of help in finding out where sculptures might be sitting, hiding in New Zealand, but that's one idea. I'd love to hear from people if there's something they'd really like to see us do. We're in a really interesting planning phase. We've got quite a few exhibition collection ideas coming, that are being developed as we speak. It would probably be premature for me to tell you what they are, but 4 or 5 exhibitions coming out of the international department.
Great, fantastic.
Most of them using the collection in different ways.
And finally, Sophie, you put up this image, which is a very good photograph, if I may say so. And let's talk about this to finish off.
Yes, well, I mean, it was a huge joy to walk into the Winter Garden in the Domain. And I didn't know where to look. I mean, I was photographing so fast. I only had about 10 minutes, and I couldn't believe how my mood was transformed just by being in that space. Because if you can't see it in the camera, in the picture, but there are extraordinary lily ponds underneath at ground level, and with those extraordinary lily pads that children were supposedly able to stand on.
The Victoria lily.
And Paxton designed the Crystal Palace using this principle from the lily pad. So it was like looking into a beautiful collection of exotic plants from the 19th century. It was like stepping back in time, but it was also so fragrant.
Yeah. Well, you certainly picked an unusual time to come, Sophie. With nobody could have foreseen that, COVID was going to break out and you were basically going to be into your own prison in your own apartment. But I have to say that personally, I could not be more delighted that you have taken over my position at the gallery. We
talk to each other almost every day. We have a wonderful collegial relationship and we're great friends, but I know that you're going to do great things, and I'm sure that all the foundation members will really enjoy meeting you in the flesh. So thank you very much for agreeing, because you've been so busy talking tonight. And so I don't, Penny, I don't know if anyone wants to ask a question of Sophie. You're mute, you're still mute.
If anyone would like to ask a question, please put your hand up now. Otherwise, we will probably bring the talk to a close.
Yeah.
So Mary and Sophie, thank you so much for being with us today. And I also
thank you, Penny, and thank you, Mary, for your generosity and mentorship and humour and good cooking.
To Gardner for her part to play in this whole series, and today's the last of the cocktail chat series that we're doing for this winter, and we're planning to bring them back again, another series next winter. I look forward to seeing everybody then.
Well, thank you, Penny, for organising it all, because you know, you did it in extremis, and I think it's been very successful.
Thank you, Penny.
I
look forward to seeing you all in the gallery. Get in touch.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a lovely evening.
Bye.